Thank you so much for the introduction, the sweet introduction, Erin. This is such an interesting journey for me as a mother and clinician, and now founder of ADHD and You. I have to say, if any of you ever question it, if you think in your mind, I will never be a speaker, or I'm never going to own my own business or write a book, watch out, because I never thought I would do any of those things either. That is, honestly, I'm a middle child. It's not really my personality to be front and center. And yet I was in a position as a parent and as a person watching over the years, evaluating really hundreds of children and seeing how much support that kids needed, and really realizing that with the intersection of my own life, if not me, who? That really is what it came down to. Who is going to be the person to share the information that I'm learning in many ways as a neuropsychologist, but in so many ways, obviously as a mother. And my son is now 21. And so he's home and doing college from here in the midst of the pandemic. And so I'm still learning so much about the college experience now. So I'm going to share, the next slide I'm going to share with you is something I call my why story. And it's why I ended up becoming a speaker and doing the things I'm doing today. So
Have you ever had a defining moment in your life that you knew would change your future forever? Let me take you back to December of 2006. I was at the office on a Friday afternoon practicing child psychology, and my last client of the day called and canceled, which is something that rarely happens in my profession. So I immediately packed up my stuff, got on my heavy down coat and my hat and gloves, and headed off to pick up my son, who was 7 years old, at elementary school. I got to my son's school and was quickly going down the hallway, and I heard this huge collective burst of laughter. So I got to his classroom and I peered in and I looked for him and didn't see him. And then I made eye contact with Mrs. Smith, his teacher, his first grade teacher. And she just pointed with this kind of stern look next door. And at that moment, my heart sank because I knew that it was actually Fun Friday, which is a day that Mrs. Smith had developed for the rule following kids. My son had never gotten to participate in Fun Friday. He was diagnosed with ADHD in kindergarten, and as you parents know, our kids do things differently. That kind of an expectation where you have to always raise your hand before speaking and stay in your seat and do your work quietly, that kind of stuff is really tough for our kids. I made a decision that day to be a fierce advocate for him. And all of that is why I'm passionate about ADHD in You and giving you the tools to be a fierce advocate for your child too.
So I'm curious if you all could tell me, and of course I have to figure out how to see your chats now because I'm not seeing them at the bottom, but when I expanded my screen, it's like I lost the chat ability. But what I would love to know is how many of you, can you chat in like are you parents of kids with ADHD? Are you teachers? What brought you to the conference so that I can get a sense of who I'm talking to today? I want to be able to see your chats, but now my whole screen is this. So if anybody has, like Erin, if you guys have a way of.
Yep. So I can read them if that's helpful.
Yeah, maybe just give me a little bit of it. You can just do a quick summary on like what you're seeing on who's who here today.
We have some speech pathologists here today with us, a number of special education teachers, some individuals who identify as people with ADHD, parents of kids with ADHD, directors of special education, school psychologist,
Great.
an attorney who works with special education law.
So
And
the full range,
yes,
full range.
I think most everyone here has been touched or serve as an advocate for people with ADHD.
Okay, good. So let's dive into what is ADHD, and I'm going to hit on some of the main points. So a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects about 9.6% of school-age kids. It's when there's a developmentally inappropriate level of inattention, hyperactivity, and or impulsivity. And we know that this is a very basic definition right here. We're going to dig a lot deeper. The more we all read about ADHD, we know that these symptoms that are typically viewed as like hallmark symptoms are just above the iceberg. They're the ones that we see, but there's so many others. And significantly impacting many aspects of development, like learning, social development, motor skills, lots about coping difficulties. And that there is no cure. The symptoms typically persist into adulthood. It's highly genetic too. So information about kiddos with ADHD. So risk factors for ADHD would be genetics, low birth weight, prematurity, alcohol, tobacco, or drug use during pregnancy, exposure to toxins like lead, brain injury. There's other risk factors, but those are many of the risk factors that we'll see as clinicians, and that untreated ADHD children are at much greater risk for behavior disorders and learning delays. Children with ADHD, this is kind of a funny word to use, cost, but I see this over and over in the research. Children with ADHD, the actual cost of raising children with ADHD in the research shows it's about 5 times as much. So when we are as clinicians saying they need tutoring, and this is something that I think about as a lot when I'm with families and I'm recommending all of these services, and that it's a real struggle for me many times as to, I feel like this is a weight that I'm putting on families and so I'm often thinking about alternatives as to how to lower those costs, who in the community can come in and do some of the tutoring and maybe swap out. Families can maybe babysit for one child and tutor or do all kinds of different things to lower those costs. That children with ADHD tend to be much more impacted by this teacher-student relationship than neurotypicals. And when I'm mentioning neurotypicals, this is children or individuals who develop more typically neurologically. So a lot of the studies I've shown indicate that that there is research around children and that the need for a teacher bond. When a child learns differently, the connection with the teacher is so key for that child to feel accepted. And so I often tell teachers, if you have students that are more challenging, bring them under your wing immediately and try to form that connection. And about 50% of children with ADHD have pretty significant social challenges. These kids also tend to be highly creative. Almost every child that I'm seeing on my caseload right now is showing me some kind of, when we do our virtual sessions together, we're engaging around their creativity, whatever it is that they're highly interested in, if it's theater or dance. and very independent minded. I have several children that I'm working with right now, and we're trying to use this independent mindset as this, because often there's some social strain around, they want to do things their way. And so we're trying to use that independence and leadership skill as a strength, and also build in more flexibility to temper some of that and focus better than neurotypicals on areas of interest. And this is something I'm really observing right now with my own son. He's home and he's really into Taoism and all kinds of meditation techniques. And he is like, he could do a giant, really well put together lecture on all of this right now, based on, there's just books all over the place about this topic. And I see this with individuals touched by ADHD. So this is a video, just a quick one to look at the neurotypical versus the ADHD brain.
Imagine a Ferrari, but with the brakes of a bicycle. That's how psychiatrist Edward Halloway describes the brain of a person with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Most people experience symptoms like fidgeting, forgetfulness, or losing focus every once in a while. But for people with ADHD, these symptoms are constantly present. Whether you're at the office, the home, or classroom, there's no off switch. That's because people with ADHD experience the world differently. One example is time. Most people perceive time as linear. However, the ADHD brain experiences time as a scattered, interconnected collection of events rather than a sequence. The cause of this is neurological. ADHD brains look and function differently from normal brains. MRI scans have shown that ADHD brains have a smaller prefrontal cortex, which is often referred to as the brain's control center. For normal brains, concentrating causes activity to increase in the prefrontal cortex. But for ADHD brains, the more they try to concentrate, the less activity there is. ADHD brains also have lower levels of dopamine. Dopamine helps control the brain's reward and pleasure centers and regulates movement and emotional responses. Low dopamine makes it extremely difficult for ADHD brains to stay motivated. They're naturally compelled to seek stimulation, causing focus to drift easily. Much like a Ferrari with bicycle brakes, the ADHD brain is powerful, but difficult to control. With proper care and maintenance, both can be managed.
Okay. So we're going to dig deeper into the research around that information, but that visual for me is really helpful. Seeing the frontal lobe smaller, I like combining visuals with learning for me.
Imagine
right, let me go on here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the structural and chemical differences. Let's look a little bit at the structural differences in the brain first. This is something I do with parents. After I've gone over feedback, I may have them in another session and really start talking about, when I'm helping people understand ADHD, it helps to show images of the brain and to really start, because you often hear parents saying, or others or teachers saying, he or she doesn't want to do A, B, or C, doesn't just gives up easily. And so it's really helpful, I think, for others to see the part of the brain that helps us sustain attention and to see what's actually going on neurologically. So the brain is smaller in certain areas, such as, let me get down here, the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is the conductor of the orchestra, basically, in the body. And we know, most of us have read by now information about how the frontal lobe helps us with planning and organization and sustaining effort. The hippocampus also is the part of the brain that is involved with memory. And so you hear a lot of people talk about memory differences. Well, that part of the brain is smaller in ADHDers. The amygdala is the part that is often associated with emotion regulation. So one of the things that I'm hoping in future DSM, the diagnostic manual for us as clinicians, that there is going to be more attention in the future on emotion regulation, because it's a huge part of ADHD that many people don't know is highly affected. We see it in many kids with ADHD, but we don't read it in the literature as much. And the corpus callosum is the part of the brain that connects the right and left hemispheres. And that junction, that part is smaller as well. And so you can understand now more about the parts, about why that there are so many neurological differences going on if that communication isn't as easy between the hemispheres. And so one of the good things, and I do tell parents this, I think it's so important to be strength oriented when you're talking with families about ADHD. First of all, because I believe it in my core that those touched by ADHD have something special that the rest of us don't, and we need the way they look at the world. And I emphasize that, but also neurologically speaking, the size differences lessen over time. And so that's important to remind families that yes, these structural differences are present, but as your child moves into adulthood, the structural differences lessen. Let's talk a bit about some of the chemical differences too. So there's impaired neurotransmitter activity in those with ADHD. And there's 4 primary regions of the brain where we see that neurotransmitter difference. We see it in the frontal cortex, the limbic system. It's very similar what we just talked about structurally. This is where we're also seeing the chemical differences. The basal ganglia, and this helps with movement, and the reticular activating system. So dopamine's role in ADHD, let's talk about that. Some researchers have found that the neurons in people with ADHD have lower concentrations of proteins called dopamine transporters. And these concentrations are known as, when you look in the research, you'll hear DTD a good amount, and they're talking about the dopamine transporter density. So lower levels of DTD in individuals show that those individuals may be at risk for ADHD. And I think the good part is that people are really doing a lot of research as to figure out what is going on here. ADHD is in fact one of the most researched neurological disorders. And a 2015 study found that the dopamine transporter gene, DAT1, may influence ADHD-like traits. And other studies have found that neurological differences, like the amount of gray matter in the brain, accounts for more of the ADHD symptoms than dopamine. So some research, when I prepare for presentations and I'm really digging deep myself, some focuses more on gray matter, some focuses on dopamine, but the bottom line is we know that the dopamine is involved. And symptoms of ADHD that I often see in children, and that we often as parents, clinicians, people see. So that's struggling to track directions. And one thing I would say is, when my son was very young, and one of the things that his vocabulary was very big. He was one of those guys that said actually and spoke about his action figures in a very detailed way. So when he was initially evaluated when he was 6 years old, the clinician wondered if maybe some of his difficulty with tracking with classroom attentiveness related to him being bored. And in my gut, I really knew that there was a lot more going on, because he should be able to track a very simple direction. If I said, Will, can you go up and grab your shoes and come down, he would be highly distracted on the way down. And yet he could tell me definitions of all kinds of things. So that's something to look for. If tracking simple directions is quite tricky and other things are really easy, it doesn't always point to ADHD. There could be an auditory processing disorder, something else, but that's, as a parent, how I could really tell something was up. Extreme forgetfulness. And this is something that he still is dealing with to a degree, and he gives me full permission to talk about him. And so I often do, because it's something that I'm living with him. I'm seeing how he operates. He is doing so well in his life in so many ways. And yet I would say about every other time he goes to work, he leaves his lunch here. And maybe my 18-year-old drives it to lunch to work for him, even though he has a lot of different things, that systems that he puts in place. And then he's working on it. But that's what I mean about the extreme forgetfulness, that it's really outside of the norm for what we see in other young adults or kids. Avoiding tasks requiring effort, except related to interests. So this is a big one. And that I'm working with so much with students in my practice now, is how to help them have side-by-side help. There's one guy I'm working with right now, and his parents have really realized that him being in his room doing schoolwork at all is just a real setup for him. And they had really hoped, they were saying to me, we just wanted him to have the self-control to be able to do the work, do his homework in his room. And instead he watches YouTube videos, and I'm really helping that family understand that that's a terrible setup for him to have that expectation, because he's sharing that he can't do it, that he avoids those tasks that are hard for him if he doesn't have more monitoring from others. And the time blindness, he will say to me, I don't know where I've been home all day. My parents have been at work. I'm supposed to have gotten an assignment done that would take an hour max, and the whole day went by. I don't even know what happened. And grades are often really inconsistent with other skills. I would say intelligence, or just other peak skills, where you see the A to F scenario quite a bit in children once they get older and they start getting grades, adolescence, where the parents will say, well, it's either an A or an F, and something's really going on then. The fidgetiness is more common. I would say the mental restlessness is what you see as someone getting older makes, and they do have that in more of the research around adolescents and young adults. And, not just young adults. This, again, is a diagnosis that persists typically. So the mental fidgetiness later more, but a lot of that physical fidgetiness early on. And the poor coping. There's a new client I started working with yesterday who was telling me he's 6, and he was telling me about the severe, like his tantrums. And he was describing how hard it is for him when there's a change, and that tantruming is really the first indicator to the parent that something was different, because he just wasn't coping normally.
Catherine, this is Erin. I was just wanted to share what you had said about parents leaving their, I mean, this is like definitely a parenting strategy that I use, is like, I give my daughter a whole bunch of time to work on something that she's not capable of.
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to share is that it's such a good reminder, like in my daughter's 504 plan, both of theirs, it says that the child will access school supports if needed.
Oh,
for organization, for test prep, for checking for understanding. And I think as a result of distance learning and other things, it's been so clear to me that we cannot leave the responsibility of the child's learning onto them when there's 35 adults walking around the building. Annalise is going to lose that packet, not know where it is, not even remember that the packet was in existence. But I think we so often think that we're empowering kids when we're just adding to their anxiety. So I really appreciate you saying that.
And you following up is so helpful for me. This is one of the things when I was having this session yesterday with this is a 12-year-old. His parents, I asked him during the session, his parents were Zooming in from their work settings, and he was actually at school meeting with me in a private room. And I said, he talked about what he had to do that night. And I said, what do you need from your parents? And he said, I don't know. Can you give me examples? And I said, do you need for them to, if you sneak up to your room, because that's what he uses, that term. He'll just get away because it's too overwhelming. I said, do you need them to come get you? And he said, yes. And he told them, even if I don't like it, please come get me because I need to do my work. So that's what we're talking about. And many times the parents and educators are afraid of enabling kids. And they're so focused, as a culture, we're so focused on building independence. And this is something I'm learning as a parent of a 21-year-old, that he's home for college, and how wonderful it is that we're having this opportunity to teach him so many things about young adulthood. Since he's home right now, we're teaching him a lot about all of these, filling in these gaps that he wasn't ready to learn. So I'm really pulling back from the idea of, and talking to parents about, this is a different trajectory. And it's okay if you make their lunch till they're in middle school. I mean, there's so many other things your child is trying to balance. So that's a really good reminder too, Erin, about what I love it that you just checked in there. Okay, so common myths, let's talk about those about ADHD, and that it's parenting related. I think anyone here today knows it's not parenting related, but you're going to hear this quite a bit, and it's important to just know it's a myth. That it's overdiagnosed. It's actually, when you really look at the research, particularly in the African American community and in communities of color, it's often underdiagnosed. And that ADHD isn't a real medical condition. We know that it is. Kids with ADHD can't ever focus. This is a real trip up for parents. They put off having their child assessed because they see them focus so well on their Lego structure. It can't possibly be ADHD. And again, the hyperfocus is, kids focus beautifully on their interests. Many can, some can't, but many children with ADHD can. And that they usually outgrow it. It changes over time. It is not outgrown, typically. And that all kids with ADHD are hyperactive. Again, the H is in there, that hyperactive. It's in the predominantly inattentive type diagnosis as well, because there's more fidgetiness. But there are many children who have the inattentive type that are more of that slow cognitive processing, more of the child that's in a daze. And they were never the child that was moving all around like my son was. Behaviors I often see in clinical settings in children with ADHD. I hear a lot of how much longer. This is something I pay attention to. If I'm assessing a child for, regardless, if they're very fixated on the time, again, there's many reasons for this, but it is something you see in kids where sustaining attention is really hard. I see a lot of that excessive talking. Some people don't know that the talking, lots and lots and lots, is a form of hyperactivity. The moving back, you'll ask a student, you'll say, I'm worried you're going to fall. And then right away, again, there's that seeking of that added sensory input. And many times it comes from moving, tipping in the chair. My son fell out of so many chairs as a child. It's just unbelievable. And he would still be talking, even when he crashed to the ground. So frequently leaves seat. There is always a reason. I have to sharpen the pencil, and I'm so thirsty and I'm hungry. And again, the body just needs to keep popping up. I've been working with a family right now on how to help their 6-year-old who they have these long meals. There's a bunch of kids in the family, and they do prayer at the beginning and a lot of things that were making it quite hard for this child. When I really broke down what was happening at home. When did he get destructive and start throwing things and all of that? It happened around times where he was required to stay seated. So we developed a number of strategies for him to be able to run around in the house, come back, stand on one leg, stand on another, lots of things to help him be able to move. And the bathroom breaks are big. This is something during testing. And so I don't see it outside of testing as much, but when you have a child in your office and they are, constantly needing to drink water and again, there's so many reasons for this, but my kids with ADHD, it's because of the need for sensory input that the water bottle is going and then the popcorn and then this and that, because it's just so difficult to stay where, even if I allow them to move, which I do, I see a lot of that. The sensitivity to noise, hypersensitivity. So this child is kids that are noticing the teeniest whisper in the hallway when you don't even notice it, or that is something to be thinking about if it's on the spectrum of so many other things that they just can't block out that noise and they appear pained by harder tasks. So, and it is, I ask my clients when they seem like that, what is this like for you? What does it feel like when I'm, and I want to get their experience to insert it in the report. So I really have what's going on with them. And for their families and to empower them so I know more about their experience. And the frustrating easily, requiring lots of repetition. These are the kids, it's rare that a child with ADHD actually says, what did you mean? Many times I notice, because I go over the instructions, they're looking at me, they might be nodding along, but then when I give them free rein to begin the task, they say, what do you mean? I don't know how to do it. And at that point, I know that they weren't really processing what I was saying. Lots of help needing slow down. I do a lot of physical things, like I cover parts of the paper. That's my main strategy, but I will many times, if I know during testing, wasn't attended to well. Let's talk from a kid's perspective about what they wish we knew about ADHD.
Dear teacher, I know it doesn't always. I really do want to listen and learn. It's just my brain is kind of different. So this is what I'd like you to know about me. I have to move, or I really can't pay attention.
Even though I'm not looking at you, I can still listen to what you're saying.
If you tell me, sit up straight, now I have to use all of my brain to do just that.
It makes me feel sad when you tell me to try harder, even though I've already tried as hard as I can. I actually listen better when I'm rocking in my chair. When you give me a bunch of directions, I start to think I will never remember all of this. Sometimes my mom or dad ends up doing all of my homework. So here's how you could maybe help. Let me get up and move while I'm learning.
Let me look wherever I want when you talk to me.
Let me rock or slouch in my chair.
No matter what, please don't take away my recess. Give me a hug I could do all by myself. Make directions very short.
Just ask me, what does your brain need right now?
And one more thing. My brain might be different than yours, but it's still amazing. Sincerely, your student.
Your student.
Your student. Your student.
So I love that video. I don't know if you guys have any comments at this point or thoughts, but feel free to be chatting them in if you have questions for me or it.
We do have a few questions here.
Great.
Two so far. I've got one here from Paul Johnson.
Is there much evidence of children who have experienced early childhood trauma developing ADHD? And I noticed that many times there is morbidity and ADHD and other mental illness like anxiety and depression.
So we're going to get to that. I'm going to answer that in this presentation around the trauma piece. This is something that really held me back early in my career from diagnosing ADHD. I would see children who had all of the numerous out of home placements and all kinds of, and it was so, I didn't know, but yet the symptoms of ADHD, I saw all the symptoms of PTSD and ADHD. And so you're in that position as a clinician where you're thinking, what do I do? I know that PTSD is present, but I don't know what to recommend around ADHD. And so when you're early in your career, it's first of all, you're more, I think I was paralyzed by some of those decisions, but as I got more experienced, I learned that, I needed to really dig deep into the family history. And if one or both parents had ADHD, it was very likely that this child also had ADHD, which is often the case, that I would gather more information. And many times the parent wouldn't be the one bringing the child to the session. It would be a foster care provider or someone else. And I would dig for more information, and that would be helpful for me. And sometimes I couldn't find it. But the point is, I would really recommend, and I would put a provisional for ADHD, and in my recommendations say, while this is provisional because we can't tease everything out right now, let's treat this child as though they do have ADHD. And many times that would clear up a lot of the challenges for them educationally. So I tried to get less rigid myself and be less afraid of making decisions around how to support the child. I hope that makes sense. So how does ADHD in the DSM-4 differ from the DSM-5? Let's talk. So symptoms still need to be evident in more than one context, but they don't have to impair functioning in multiple contexts. So if a parent's ratings are subclinical and the school ratings are in the clinical range, you can still make that diagnosis. And that's a hang up that a lot of us were in at times. So descriptors of ADHD in the DSM-5 now are more developmentally appropriate. For example, teens are not expected to be driven like a motor, right? Like the younger children, whereas they have more of appropriate hyperactive symptoms like uncomfortable sitting still for extended periods. The DSM-4 ADHD could not be diagnosed this just blows my mind and always did, if the child also had autism. Whereas in the DSM-5, they're finally allowing both of those diagnoses to be made in the same child. The age of onset is now more flexible. So several inattentive and hyperactive symptoms present before 12 versus 7 years old. And this is a lot of the reason for this is that symptoms show up more as the academic demands increase in life, in school. And so many times parents would be saying, well, they were fidgety. And we did notice that attention was harder, but it wasn't like they were failing school until 6th grade or something like that. So diagnoses often associated with ADHD in children. So anxiety disorders, about 30% of children with ADHD are also diagnosed with anxiety disorders. Depression, the number is a little bit lower than 30, but there's a very high number still that are experiencing depression. There's a high number, a lot of kids with ADHD have oppositional defiant disorder. And I just listened to a really good attitude podcast about oppositional defiant disorder. And it's always like I just kind of hate saying ODD. I've always felt that children with ADHD who have the right support many times can drop this ODD diagnosis. I think it's important for me to remember as a clinician that it's describing symptoms that relate to a child's difficulty with authority figures that are well beyond what the norm, and that the diagnosis helps us provide the right kind of support for children. And this is a diagnosis where we need a lot of involvement to teach the family quite a bit about how to support a child with ODD. There is a lot of more research coming out about the genetic basis of oppositional defiant disorder. In the past, like many diagnoses, parents were blamed. For example, with, autism, mothers were blamed. And with schizophrenia, mothers were blamed. So with oppositional defiant disorder, I think now what we're learning is that there is this giant genetic thread, and one parent in particular often has had it. And so I try to loop that parent in when I'm working with the family quite a bit. And many times it's a father who says, I was just like it. I was just like my son or daughter. And we spend time talking about that experience and me really trying to understand what that was like for that parent and joining and getting that parent on board big time. Learning disabilities are very, very common. The numbers range from, I see in the literature, 40 to 70%. I think it's more like 50 to 70% of kids with ADHD. I'm always surprised when a child does not have, I'm always thinking for the family, that's so wonderful that the learning part is easier for your child. And sometimes I think they're looking at me like, what? But because I know how often children have learning disabilities. So dysgraphia and the dyslexia and this dyscalculia, we're going to dig a lot deeper into. Let's talk about what's different with specific learning disorders in the DSM-5. So the way the DSM-5 is describing learning disorders is a neurodevelopmental disorder that impedes learning and academic skills as indicated by the presence of at least one of these symptoms that are going to list below that have persisted for 6 months despite help. So inaccurate or slow and effortful word reading, difficulty understanding the meaning of what's read, difficulty with spelling, difficulty with written expression, and difficulty mastering number sense. So one of those has to be present for at least 6 months with interventions already happening. Let's talk about the affected academic areas are substantially and quantifiably below age mates. This is a tricky one because in school systems, the requirements are you still need to have a big gap between intellect and academics to receive services. Whereas in the DSM-5, that the diagnosis that school systems are not making the learning disorder diagnoses. We as clinicians are making those diagnoses, but even when we do, it does not mean that a child is going to meet criteria for school-based services. The learning difficulties begin during school-aged years, but may not fully manifest until like maybe middle school or even high school when the academic demands, some students even college, when they finally get to a point where they're like, I just cannot retain information. I never really have been able to. I've had to spend hours and hours, but now even when I'm doing that, I can't make the grades. And that the learning difficulties are not better accounted for by an intellectual, visual, or auditory challenge. Okay. I know that's a ton. I try to make the slides as succinct as I can, and it's just so hard with the learning disorder stuff. So primary changes, let's look at this one. Okay, so in terms of the changes in the DSM-5, there's the elimination of the IQ achievement. That's what I said. School systems still have it. And I was just giving a talk for Anoka County, or 2 talks for them. And that's the struggle for the social workers there, is that their students, they see that the kids have learning disabilities, but the students aren't qualifying for services. And that's where we have to get smart and really try to figure out how to creatively support the students. And I'll talk about that. Changed from subtypes of LD, like reading, mathematics, written expression, to an overarching category. So the overarching category is the learning disorder with, impacting one of these areas. And that the cutoff scores are now arbitrary, meaning that the clinician gets to do more of that judging. It's not like you have to have a 30-point difference between intellect and, single word reading. We as a clinician, and that's something I really do love, because I I like not having it that the student was 1 point off. And in my gut, I know the student has dyslexia. Why is this not moving? Okay. So in the DSM-4, the psychometric data alone, oh, I see a little typo, were insufficient for the DSM-5 diagnosis. A much closer. So now this is one of the nice parts about the DSM-5. There's a lot closer of a collaboration required between educators, clinicians, parents. We're all coming together and looking at all of the information more. This is one of the benefits. And that's one of the things I like about doing the online work in the pandemic. It is one of the benefits because I Zoom with teachers now much more easily. I can just send over a release electronically and I can meet with teachers and find out what they're noticing about the students I'm seeing and involve parents more easily. It's been really wonderful. And so with the DSM-5, there is, you can vary, like learning disorder affecting reading, and then you'll put in parentheses mild, moderate, or severe. And a lot of this, again, is up to the clinician's judgment. The qualifying cutoff scores, oops, I had that on the previous slide. I want you guys to listen. I'm afraid if I go too deep into some things, I won't get through. And you all have the slides that you can look through some of that other information. But what I want to do is this student, I thought I'm going to stop like 3/4 into this video because there's some stuff at the end that we don't need to watch. But he does a great job describing what it's like for him having dyslexia.
Dyslexia, what it is to me is that I just have a hard time reading and writing and then trying to take notes and understand and process what my teachers say. Like sometimes I have a hard time saying it, so sometimes they think it's like made up or something. And so they think I just make an excuse for not being good at English or like writing, just my writing's really bad or my just reading and grammar and stuff. And they think I just make up an excuse and it's not an excuse and it's really something wrong with me. Sometimes when we're taking notes in class, it feels like we're like out catching butterflies and it takes me forever just to catch one butterfly. And then the whole other class have caught like 3 butterflies and I have to hurry up and catch up and take my time to catch 2 other butterflies. And it's just hard because it took me forever to get the first one. Well, the best thing about dyslexia is that like with like the 5 senses, when you're missing one, it heightens other ones. So since I'm missing kind of my English kind of section of my brain, it heightens other stuff like science and math. And I do excel in those classes and I just love those classes. And I just love doing scientific things like inventing stuff, programming stuff. What I would tell someone else with dyslexia is that they're not stupid and they can do it. And you just gotta think of your own way to like take in information and stuff. And sometimes maybe my stuff will help them, maybe not. Maybe their stuff will help me, maybe not. But just that they're for sure not stupid. They're actually probably smarter than some kids in some subjects. Everyone's smarter than someone in a different way. What I wish my teachers knew about dyslexia is that I need more time on things and I need more breaks so I can process it, and just to let me like, instead of having a deadline for everything and like the next day, sometimes I need more time than that to like comprehend what it means and try to understand it fully and then finish it, make sure it's good. Because most of the times I feel rushed by my like homework and that it's just like I feel like I do a crappy job because I don't have enough time to understand what I did. Because it helps me like to move and to process so better. And some teachers get mad at me for moving. It kind of makes me mad because that's how I pay attention and that's how I get stuff done. It keeps my brain like flowing and I can just like process it better. It's like a river. If it's not flowing, it can't really take anything. So if I get it flowing, then it can actually start taking stuff and then it'll start like making more sense and stuff. The things that have helped me that teachers have done is when I was in 5th grade, I had this teacher named Mr. Zimmerman. And he helped me a lot when it was about essays and stuff. Like he would give me more time and give me a lot of like corrections and why this was wrong and whatnot. And that helped me a lot. Something that's helped me is that one of my teachers, when we were in class, we do a PowerPoint and then like we take notes from the PowerPoint. And so sometimes I try to focus and sometimes I only get a little bit of notes and she hurries up and goes to the next slide. Sometimes I'll miss like a couple of sentences or something. And then and she puts the PowerPoints online, so I can always go back and look at them and understand it and then write it down and like get all the notes I needed. What I would say to parents to help their kids out is that just not to rush or whatever, let them take their time. And if they need help, they will probably ask you. And for the most part, like, this is how I am. I just like trying to figure out myself, like looking online for resources. And if I can't find it, I'll ask my parents what this means or what that means. And then I'll figure it out by them and then I'll do it. But them just hounding me to do it makes it way worse. It just, like, I can't focus because I'm trying to focus on them. I'm trying to please them, and I have to do my homework at the same time. And it's hard because I don't know how to do it. And they're just yelling at me, do it. And if you don't know how to do something, people tell you to do it, you don't know what to do.
Okay. So he's just such an articulate young man, and you can see all the moving, you see the need to move. The thing that I wanted to clarify when he mentioned at the end about he is different than many of my clients in that he can stay on track when he's struggling. And so I want others to know that, for example, some of my clients will say, I've got it, and they don't. And so for parents to be observing, obviously, if you want to give your students space to learn and to develop their own independence as they're doing their work, that's so important. But if the student repeatedly isn't getting it done, then clearly they don't have as much of that ability to work independently as the student. So,
Catherine, do you have any advice for us?
Dyslexia.
Let me stop this. Yeah.
Regarding a better strategy for, again, I'll just use my personal examples because I don't want to generalize. Some people in my family will say, I got it.
Yeah.
And they clearly don't.
Yeah.
But then there's that tug of the student really resisting support, whereas that's the very thing that they need. And I'm just wondering, there's got to be a better way to do things than I'm doing.
Oh, it is. I have been, Erin, on all different layers of this in my own parenting and then with my own clients. And one of the great parts about getting a third party involved is that this is just one thing I noticed when I start working with a student, and when you have another person helping outside of the family, the first thing I want from that student is what is holding you, what are your, obviously I'm looking at strengths, but I also want to find out if you could envision your life a lot easier when it comes to school. I like to have them what would be different? And they will say, I wouldn't always have late work. I would have this, I would have this. So I pull back to that and be able to say, when the parent is like, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do, I can't help. And then so I'll say, well, let's just me and the student meet next time. And then I'll say, okay, remember what you want so badly. You want this. And then it's just painful though. It's this painful process but I want to do it myself. And I don't want them after me. And so we're always looking for that collaborative problem solving where the student is having some say and then the parent is having, and it's like this place where nobody loses, but everybody's getting, it's like, well, this is what I'm seeing. And it's like, but I want you out of my life. But, but this is what my job is. Well, let's try this tomorrow, just this one thing. And so many times that's that whole process. And it takes maturing on the student's part to start being more open. And when I try to force it with students, I lose, or the parent loses. And when they get everything, all their stuff, I want to be in my room, I don't want you bothering me, the anxiety rises and they lose. So it's kind of what I notice. Let's see if I can get beyond this video. Okay, so let's talk about the DSM-5 with reading, and let's talk about the specific learning disorder with impairment in reading. So there's three subcomponents of the reading disorder that are differentiated. We've got the word reading accuracy, reading rate, and fluency in reading comprehension. So there's various main parts that we're looking at when we're looking at a learning disorder affecting reading, and the common manifestations of reading disorders are difficulty decoding single words, difficulty learning letter sound correspondence. So this letter makes this sound. And these are things you'll notice early on with kids that go on well beyond the time that other children are reading easily. The phonemic awareness, meaning phonemic awareness is the struggle to understand that spoken words are made of individual sounds. The best person I can describe when I talk about this, my husband has dyslexia. And so I've learned a lot through him, being married to him and just observing, and me asking him a lot about what reading was like when he was younger. And he described it as the letters made absolutely no sense to him. That's what he said. And so he had to memorize everything. When I've learned more and more about dyslexia and reading Sally Shaywitz books around dyslexia, it's like the file drawers are really off. So you pull one file drawer out looking for letter sounds, but you get something else. And so, like that student shared, though, there's these other strengths. My husband can tell me how anything works, and to a point where I'm not interested. I can't learn it, but he will try to tell me these pipes go here and there. And I mean, because he just gets it. Whenever we have people at the house trying to fix something, he understands as well. These are some of the things really good with hands-on, and it's so important to have the hands-on learning part. So symptoms of the learning disability change across the lifespan. And of course, I'm having to be really succinct, but in preschool age, you'll often see children who have difficulty that end up having dyslexia, they struggle to learn nursery rhymes, the rhyming. And so when we're assessing for dyslexia, there are rhyming subtests that we're looking at. There's often mispronouncing of words that seem pretty atypical, and the mispronunciation is happening after correction over and over again. And I see this with my husband. He has certain words, I don't correct him anymore, but there's just certain words, the way that he has the X in the wrong place in his mind, the way he says it. And there's no point, I just know he doesn't hear it and he's not going to shift it. And that's just the way it is. Elementary school, failure to recognize letters. That's a big one. Can't read simple words. For example, and odd reading errors like reading big as goat, where you can tell when you're watching that child, when I do these subtests, they're reading something entirely different that is on the page. And they can't learn spatial concepts as easily. Many children with dyslexia, they're having left as right. And so there's so many, you're teaching all the little ways you have to teach them. When you hold up your right hand, when you hold up your left hand, you see an L for left. So they're the students that you teach all of those skills to, because they're not getting it naturally. In middle school, you'll see more of skipping parts of multisyllable words, poor comprehension. They're slow readers. I have a very good friend whose daughter took forever to get through books. And she just thought, she just would say to me, she just doesn't care about reading. She doesn't care about spelling either. She's a terrible speller. And I said, you really should get her evaluated. This is a close friend, so I could do that. And ultimately, her phonetic decoding scores on the testing were just really low. And so she's getting added help in college now in reading, and it's wonderful. She is so happy she was evaluated. She did avoid reading all the time. In high school, you'll see like mastering decoding words, yet reading slowly with great effort. This is something here. I've got my people covering the bottom part of this slide. So if this is where you're going to see me. I have trouble with the virtual presentation, but I have a learning disability in virtual presentations. Okay. All right. So let's move on here. So with dyslexia, you will see above the iceberg what we see from that person really is we'll see slow reading often, avoiding reading, mispronouncing words while reading, poor spelling. These are the things that my friend saw in her daughter. Beneath that, there's often that struggle to retrieve the words. That's what was happening for her. She often was having difficulty remembering people's names. This is a real thing. My husband will get pretty anxious. He used to often about like, saying to me before we go to gatherings, like, I never can remember names. And I always just tell him, that's okay. It doesn't matter. It's okay. Difficulty remembering directions. And everybody's different. Like he's incredible with directions, but the people's names, he's also developed a lot of strategies to try to help him remember names, like certainly for an interview or something like that. When you really need that, he's learned strategies and I've practiced them with him. And anxiety in academic settings is often really, really common for people with dyslexia. When he was younger, learned to make himself throw up on command. Literally, he would, because he couldn't stand being in the classroom so much, he would throw up and then he would basically get sent out of the classroom. Okay. So let's talk reading disorder. I get this question a lot versus dyslexia. So dyslexia is a reading disability, but not all reading disabilities are dyslexia. So let's talk about it. We need to understand what specifically is causing the reading delay to look at this distinction. So dyslexia is primarily a phonological processing disorder. Making the connections between the sound and the letter is really, in all of those other areas I talked about related to phonemic awareness, all of that is the foundational challenge for people with dyslexia. Difficulty translating the meaning of letters into sounds, separating sounds, combining multiple sounds. 70 to 80% of those who struggle with reading have dyslexia, whereas the other 20 struggle to read for other reasons related to visual tracking. I am going to get this out of my way here. And language comprehension or brain injury can certainly trigger reading disorders as well. Hopefully that makes sense. So what do you do if you suspect a child is dyslexic? You're going to schedule, one of the first things to do is schedule an appointment with the general practitioner to rule out vision or hearing problem. Meet with the child's special education needs coordinator to discuss concerns and a desire for testing. If feasible, seek a private evaluation. I don't have any, Groves Academy is a place where I speak and I do things for them. They do a nice job with learning disability assessments. There's not an intensive emotional, like psychological aspect of their testing, but they do a beautiful job with intellectual and academic achievement testing. So to look at learning disabilities. The Learning Disabilities Association of Minnesota they have a listing of lots of specialists in this area, pediatric neuropsychologists like myself, although I'm really limiting the amount of testing that I'm doing so that I can focus more on advocacy. Educational psychologists also do a really nice job. So one thing to do is contact the Minnesota Department of Education. This is a link that I provided that has some really good information about how to, what supports are available for students with dyslexia. This is I learned about this from one of the social workers in Anoka County, the Simon Technology Center at Pacer. They offer free individualized training sessions on how to use educational assistive technology, which is amazing. So this person's child received great information on how to address her specific learning disabilities with reading. Orton Gillingham of Minnesota. When my son was struggling, he'd repeated kindergarten, and my husband has dyslexia. So I knew that there was a genetic piece, and he was in the lowest reading group in first grade. So he was already the oldest child in the class. I knew that I wanted him. He had had that assessment when he was 6, and they had not flagged him as having as a child that looked like he was going to have dyslexia. For me, though, I wanted him to start getting tutoring, and it turns out he bounced up into the typical reading group within a year. And he has not had the same challenges as my husband, and does not have dyslexia, although he has dysgraphia. And he got great tutoring. We found, I went and we met about 4 different tutors that we found the names of on Orton Gillingham of Minnesota's site. And we found the one who basically was the most structured and playful, and who spoke to him the most during our meeting. She was very interested in engaging him. She had all kinds of reward drawers, and she allowed him to move, and I knew she was a great fit. Reading camps are another option. There are also, listings of tutors. I think I'm trying to link that with Orton Gillingham. There's teacher trainings for learning more about how to do Orton Gillingham. It's an intensive program. It's like a 2-year program on really how to become an Orton Gillingham specialist. So if we're looking so I'm going to check in with you guys for a second and to see how you're doing, just because I've been talking away. Erin, you feel like, how should I just keep moving on talking about dyscalculia, or do you have some questions?
I think it would be, if you're comfortable with it, we've covered a bit of information here.
Sure.
I think I did see a question, one question about supporting individuals with ADHD in a remote setting. And that's a lot of what our teachers are doing right now.
Yeah.
And I think that we as special educators are always wondering our place. Well, I'm going to rephrase that. I think we all acknowledge how imperative reading is to school success. And I wonder if people who are here with us today have any questions for you about that.
Sure.
I did share in the chat a course that my colleague Noreen had shared with our team. And so I think that my request from the audience would be that if you have any supportive reading instructive materials, to put those in the chat.
Yes.
And then if you feel comfortable, Catherine, asking or answering some direct questions from people who are here.
Sure.
Maybe if we took some time to do that, that would be helpful. I know we have a break coming up. Actually, that's a total lie.
We did. You're remembering our previous schedule.
You're gracious. I have a loose relationship with time. So I'm going to stop rambling and just open it up for questions. And then if people have reading materials or golden nuggets to share, if you could pop that into the chat. I'm so thrilled this is being recorded and this ramble will be captured.
You're doing great, Erin.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, reading rockets. I see that. Used Orton Gilling with amazing success. On
our team, our Hella, who is here somewhere, she is a ninja for reading, and she really talks quite a bit about Wilson reading. So if anyone here is wondering about that program, and then also I would just share, Catherine, that we recently have reconnected with Groves, and Groves Academy does serve a number of public and private schools. And we're hoping to develop a better collaboration with with Groves.
Yeah.
So our audience, you can expect some sort of training from Indigo Education about reading here in the new school year. And we're just really super hopeful that that will address more student needs.
Yeah.
My colleague Karina just shared here that Wilson is closely related to Orton, and Miss Sarah also endorses the Wilson reading system.
I do too. The only thing I know is that it's highly similar to Orton Gillingham. And I have a friend on the East Coast who all three of her kids have done Wilson. She will call me and just say, how did this happen that all three of my kids have dyslexia? And Wilson has been the wonderful system for all of them and becoming really strong readers.
Catherine, remind me, or maybe the audience knows, either Wilson, they're very similar, but one of them starts at like a pre-reader level. So kids who maybe either have a risk factor or have had some of those neurodevelopmental captures. I think it's Wilson, but I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to do some research. But I know one of them is has like a pre-reader or an early age range for serving. So if you have kids who are at risk or showing some of those neurodevelopmental markers, you can start them without having the reading skills settled.
Yeah, that's so important. And I remember when, some of there's articles that I've read and shared with families, and I used to give copies of a few different articles in my office to families when there was this idea in the educational world, and I know it because multiple teachers I think it was being taught to teachers that children really didn't need intervention for lags in reading until after second grade many times. And the literature points that is not accurate at all. And that if your child is lagging in reading, that we see the red flags early on and there's no need to wait.
I mean, yeah, even navigating the physical book is a pre-reading skill for, little kids to even understand that the book opens from right to left, and page turning and understanding, for picture books, the way that the words flow across the page, or you're reading, up and down. And just, we really want to make it a goal here to help our schools serve their students better in the area of reading, because that's just the foundation of so much growth and blah, blah, blah.
And confidence in school. We see the kids that, children are watching the kids with the big fat books, the Harry Potter books, and there's so much envy going on, and immediately associating with, I'm not smart. And so getting that support early on in the reading is huge. And one of the things I really noticed with my own son, with him, is that he would press and I see it with clients who are struggling when I'm assessing reading, he would like take the palms of his hands and press in on his eyes, kind of like almost like forcing his eyes to stay on the page. And just like, I'm trying to, and because I would say, William, look at the page. And his eyes would, like, I describe it I remember writing about this in my book, about how his eyes would just dance all over the room. And so the act of reading, even though it's very interesting. So I think, for me, I didn't need a dyslexia diagnosis to know that he needed a lot of reading help. And I wouldn't have known that he would have become a really strong reader either. I had no idea. But so as parents, I think sometimes you don't need to wait till you have a formal diagnosis. I think it's very important to go ahead and get testing set up, but you can be getting support in place, at least privately, if you're one of those privileged people who can get someone to get on board to start helping with reading. And if you're not in that position, I always, some parents will go to or I know some clients of mine who've had a few sessions with specialists in Orton Gillingham, and then they've really picked it up, and they're like, I'm not going to be a major expert, but I've sat in on 2 months of sessions and I've learned enough that I'm going to try to do it, primarily myself. So it doesn't have to be this specific to your program. There's a lot that we can do in collaboration with experts without maybe paying all of those high fees for the tutoring.
Yeah, I wonder maybe if that's something that a number of us in the charter community can collaborate on, is a string of sessions for parents or caregivers on just reading strategies. I'm sure multiple schools here who are represented may do that, but that might be something that would be low cost and accessible.
I love it that there's the LDA, Minnesota LDA has a listing of tutors willing to barter. Like, this is so great for me to see that. That's wonderful. And so, yes, getting the reading skills up is key. And I always say for my families where the child has ADHD, I want them to become better than average. I mean, sort of like we want to pull them up, but then barely. I always say to families, if you can continue with the person that's supporting your child in reading, don't stop right when they become average. I mean, because it's harder to focus when you have ADHD. I want that child, their learning to be even easier, so that it's since learning is often harder. Does that make sense? So I'm happy to jump back into dyscalculia if that feels good.
Sorry to interject here, but on our schedule, we do have a break scheduled from 10:30 to 10:45.
Oh, good. Okay, I didn't see that.
If everybody wants to continue going, we can do that, or we can take a break.
Either way, you guys tell me what you want. What does the group want?
Well, Catherine, you may also want a break.
Well, I have a decent amount that I am going over, so I'm comfortable going. I guess I'm a little, some of this, I mean, it's just a matter of what I'll cover completely. And so you guys have my slides as well. So really, truly, I'm good. I could keep going, but you guys let me.
Let's plug away. If people need breaks, they can self-select out and hop back in.
Great.
So some people are saying that they scheduled things during the break that they do. But I could just keep going. Okay.
Yeah, let's just keep plugging away, and it's recorded.
Perfect. That's what we'll do. Okay. All right. So let's talk about math for a second. So dyscalculia is what we're going to hear is the alternative term for a specific learning disorder with an impairment in mathematics. So developmental dyscalculia impairment is another term that you'll use. It's an impairment you'll hear developmental dyscalculia. It's an impairment in number sense. And there's a theory that there's damage to the parietal lobe of the brain that helps us understand quantities. It's equal among genders, and it's often associated with other learning disabilities. So I'm going to get this chat out of my way. Symptoms of dyscalculia, they change, and I'm going to do this for the other learning disability we talk about as well, just really kind of showing what those symptoms look like as someone gets older. In preschool, concepts like biggest and smallest can be really tough. And again, I don't want parents panicking because there's a lot of the symptoms that you'll need to see. It doesn't mean if there's one or even two that your child has this challenge. Recognizing numbers is particularly hard, and ordering numbers. In elementary school, then I talk about this one, counting money. My daughter had so much difficulty counting money, and she does not have dyscalculia, but my husband would just be like, oh my goodness, like what is going on here? But she eventually got it. Telling time can be really hard. Concepts, greater than, less than, those kind of concepts. In middle school, you'll often see that, even things like keeping score during a game, you'll notice that some kids with dyscalculia, it's just particularly hard. Writing and sequencing numbers tends to be hard. And in high school, charts and graphs. Again, I'm just kind of picking out a few of the symptoms in the larger articles that I read, calculating percentages. So the main thing to notice is relative to general information processing, that math is something where you're noticing students, we're learning the math facts. Many kids with ADHD, rote memorization is quite hard unless it's an interest. So math facts, that's something I often ask about. Even when I'm looking at some of the markers for ADHD, if a child had a terrible time learning math facts, that is, when I'm looking at all of the pieces, that's really common. And it's also very common in dyscalculia. So what do you do if you suspect? So again, you're going to do those previous recommendations I gave if you're suspecting dyslexia, and you're going to seeking a private evaluation is always helpful as a family to be able to gather more information outside of the school. Not everybody has that option. Minnesota neuropsychology has some specific things on assessing dyscalculia, which I thought was interesting. And there's some specific accommodations for teens that I list in this link as well. Providing a chart of math facts. So there's no need that a child with dyscalculia has to be, if they're struggling with 3 times 4 still, trying to spend all of their energy retrieving 12 or 3 times 4. So teachers can, it's not being overly catering to the student to provide them with, let them have the math facts on their desk, let them use the calculator. Most teachers do that already, and allow extra time for tests, allowing students to keep a list of the steps involved for complex math problems, since sequencing those steps is so hard. Seeking tutoring, we're going to look at, I am often encouraging my students who are struggling, I'm finding out from them, when are your teacher's office hours? Many times they don't know. So they're emailing the teacher during our session. They're at home, I'm here, and I'm trying the best I can to have them not have a long list of things when we get done together. So let's email the teacher, they're emailing, and really then I want them as much as they can to show up to those office hours, to seek help so they feel less alone. Private tutoring, we had someone work with my son who was hockey. He was a few years older than him in hockey. He would come over, and it was such a relief to see his gigantic shoes in our entryway. And my son and he worked together, and he felt comfortable with him because he was just a few years older. He was an amazing math student, and it was really affordable. And there's some really nice online computer programs, Khan Academy. There's free math practice problems where you can plug in what you're trying to work on and see and get some really nice examples. If we're looking at the specific learning disorder affecting written expression, it's called dysgraphia. And it's really, the crux of it is difficulty putting one's thoughts on paper. There's often problems with spelling, grammar, and punctuation. And even when students spell well on like a spelling test, transferring those words into an essay, you'll see often the spelling falls apart. And it's highly comorbid with ADHD. And it's often associated with weaknesses in executive functioning and the visual and fine motor impairment. And so you can see how hard this is when the student is struggling with the actual physical part, the graphomotor part of writing, and then with how do I get started on this and all of the transition statements. So I encourage students, I think most students with ADHD could use a decent amount of help in writing if they don't even meet criteria for dysgraphia. So this is how the symptoms are. Again, I'm going to show you what you may be looking for. Struggling to copy letters. These are the things that we really noticed with our son. He did a lot of the reversals well beyond the age. So reversals are normal for many students when they're young, but the kids that keep reversing 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, for him, he was working with his Orton Gillingham tutor for writing, even though he didn't need it for reading anymore. And he worked with her off and on throughout middle school. So copying letters, writing his name was really giant the way he wrote it. He's smashing the letters kind of together, not knowing the spacing, often resisting drawing. He wasn't one that was finding drawing fun because he gripped the pencil so hard and it was actually painful for his hand. Poor spelling is something that you'll often see in your students with dysgraphia, intermixing upper and lower case. This is a smart thing that they learn to do because they can't figure out if a D is a B, right? So in that same word, you'll see upper and lower case. The erasing was such a big thing that was going on at my house, and like causing holes in papers from erasing. Part of that is some of the impulsivity that comes along with ADHD, is that you're writing and then you're not slowing down enough to think about what letter you should have put, and it's really hard. And so once they learn to type, it gets a lot easier. The spacing of letters. So not knowing how to put a space between words is really common. So his tutor had him put his finger often after, do different things with his left hand to have a finger space. And in middle school, lots of arguing happens around writing. That's what parents will tell me often is like the last straw. This was, they were trying to get their child to write, and then a giant explosion happened. And anytime we see something like that, we know that there's something going on, that it's not just bad behavior. The hand pain is a real thing. And it's often, it's that motor skill part that's behind. In high school, organizing of the writing is something that many students with dysgraphia are still getting support on. And dysgraphia diagnosis does not mean that your child will not become a great writer. Our son is doing very well in his writing in college, and his thank you notes still look kind of weird though. So there's still funky stuff a little bit in the handwriting, but that's, in my opinion, it's okay. What to do. Okay, so we talked about, I'm just going to add some other resources. So Groves, I've got some of the same ones here. Encouraging and improving keyboarding, teaching the student voice activated computer programs. My son never got into this, but his tutor tried with him, and some of her students love it. So I would say it's something to try, and to not just try once, to really, because you have to teach the student how to do it. See if it could be a help. Common accommodations and modifications. Writing, allowing the student to write one paragraph versus two. Offering the student a sample of a written assignment. This is huge. Let the student see what a final essay is supposed to look like. They're not going to copy the essay word for word or anything like it. I think because students with ADHD often have, and dysgraphia, have such trouble with the tracking from the board down to their desk, I encourage teachers to let that student have it at their desk and just use it as a model for how to approach the assignment. Letting the student have a copy of notes, encouraging the student to turn in work with the teacher in chunks. And don't count off for spelling. Offering the student, this is one that I'm seeing some students in alternative schools. I have a kid right now who cannot get himself to dictate or be involved in the writing. It's like we have done everything. And for him, part of the rigidity that is cognitive for him, where he just can't seem to do some of the written work. I think he just gets so locked down and panicked. So they're letting him do alternative things and show his learning in different ways. And he's done some amazing constructions and all kinds of things. That's what they're doing in this school. And I think it's really what they needed to do for him. So here are the other, those other pieces. We still have some of like the posters of a lot of the spelling rules still to this day that like the tutor gave my son that have been really helpful, that he references. Neuropsych testing is something that I've been doing for a really long time. I'm doing a lot less of these days, but it is, let's talk about what it is. And it's a specialized evaluation to look at brain functioning, how it's functioning, a series of tasks designed to measure specific aspects of the brain functioning, like verbal reasoning, visual, looking at memory and attention. And there's also it's so important. One of the things I love about neuropsych testing is the inclusion of emotional, social, and behavioral development. I see this as giant in looking at these pieces of how a child is doing. This testing is clarifying what's easy and what's hard. And if you see a neuropsych that's not focusing a good amount on strengths, then I'm sad about that. And I think it's so important to be noting what that child is doing well. And it's providing very detailed, specific recommendations to improve your child's functioning. So what should you expect during these? You should expect that there's an in-depth parent or caregiver interview that has a developmental history, a medical history. They're looking at current symptoms, academics, social skills. It's a several hour long process. It's going to vary. Obviously, a 6-year-old's testing is going to take a lot less time. Sometimes that 6-year-old and I are running around and leaving my office and going up and down the hallway, and it does take a lot longer than you would imagine. But generally speaking, the evaluation is going to take a lot longer for a high school student than a kindergartner. For younger kids, you can describe the testing as, we're going to be playing a lot of games. I do tell parents to add, and it's kind of like school, because kids will come in when I was doing in-person testing, and they're pretty disappointed when they see all the games and that they're not going to spend a lot of the time playing those games. Feedback sessions, you're going to go over the test findings with families. I think it's really nice to do that on a separate day so that the evaluator is going to score everything, finish gathering and, getting the feedback assimilated. And then you're going to have a session where you go over the results and you go over test findings, you review recommendations. In terms of adolescents and children, what my experience has been is that parents get emotional during feedbacks. And so I like to have feedback sessions where the child is not present for the first meeting. Parents are processing a lot of information. And even if they knew that their child had ADHD or dyslexia or dysgraphia, it's still, the parent needs time to process, and they have to then take care of their child if the child is in the room. And it's just not fair. The child is wondering what's going on. So I never do feedbacks that way. If a parent cannot have someone else take care of the child, then I will just set that child up in the hallway and have them playing. And I let them know that it's always an adult meeting. And then we have them come in at the end and play some. And if there's an adolescent, I still like to do my initial feedback with parents if possible. If the adolescent is really anxious, I will include them and we'll just talk it through, and I'm flexible. I don't want the adolescent to be anxious and really worried about why are you meeting with my parent first? So every time I check with the teen and kind of find out what they would like to do. And what's the difference between a neuropsych and a school eval? And so for a neuropsych, the psychologist is specializing in neuropsychology. It's more in-depth typically, and it focuses more understanding why a client is functioning a certain way. Whereas a psychoeducational eval, it's done by school psychologists. The primary focus is to understand the child's learning style from an educational perspective. Then that you're identifying the child's strengths and challenges specific to the school environment. It's focusing more on what is happening in school. So when should we refer kiddos or clients to neuropsych testing? If your client has complex learning issues like a reading lag, if there's a developmental disability or a genetic disorder, if there's a history of neurological insults or diseases such as seizures, head injury, or loss of consciousness, or if there's symptoms of a neurodevelopmental disorder such as inattention, impulsivity, or disordered development like stereotypical motor mannerisms or sensory differences. And if there's a psychiatric condition such as disruptive mood, dysregulation disorder, bipolar disorder, or psychotic features, one of the things that can be really helpful is looking at processing speed. because we know with certain psychiatric disorders, executive functioning and processing speed is greatly impacted, and it can help us diagnostically. And having someone with a client who many times psychiatrists and other people, they don't have the same concentrated time with a client for that many hours to really look at how they're doing. Again, the benefits is it really can change the trajectory of a child's life, an adolescent's life. Honestly, I do have families tell me after the neuropsych testing, the recommendations you made allowed for my child to come home from residential and stay home. It's the first time they were ever able to stay home. Things like that. And it is very powerful to hear that from families, because you're clarifying a diagnosis that maybe was wrong for many years. And you're changing the treatment plan. You're often collaborating with a med provider who is then, based on your what you find, making different medication changes. It changes the therapies the child's getting often. If that child is not making progress and you do a reeval, you reevaluate 2 years later, you're not going to do the same therapies if their reading is not grown. It's looking at, is a 504 or an IEP, and obviously, the neuropsychologist is collaborating with other professionals to make these decisions, and that's what's nice. Otherwise, it would be too nerve-wracking of a job. But you're really looking at, based on your opinion after seeing many, many kids, what type of services do you think would work best as well? And it's an independent, unbiased way to track a child's progress every few years. That's why I don't like to do therapy with kids that I evaluate, because it gets muddy. And so you're looking, I wonder why I have, so with dyslexia, it's a way to really assess progress in areas of, okay. So you're going to change those interventions, like for example, with dyslexia, if those skills are not improving. Looking here, we can talk about some of the support strategies. I'm going to look at all of my slides for a second and see about my pacing. We can have a little question time too, if that seems fitting, Erin, if you have some things that I could answer.
Certainly.
Let me look at what slide here. Anything about what I've been talking about that I could answer around that learning piece or around neuropsych testing?
So one thing is that what you were saying about some of the challenges our learners have is that it really reminded me to take a closer look at the child study or the identification process for children with disabilities in our schools. In that, I think it was just a good reminder that some strategies will be supportive, and some students may struggle with the organization, or you had mentioned graphs or counting money or something else. Like some of those skills will need to be worked on over time. And it's just a good reminder for me to keep a good timeline on who's in the intervention process and how long they've been there.
Yes.
I think sometimes we let kids stay in the intervention process for too long because we really certainly want to make sure that there's a high correlation between those who are referred to special education and those who are evaluated and meet criteria. But some of these struggles aren't going to go away, and that we just need to keep kind of adding to the student's bag of tricks.
Yeah.
I also think that we're typically on the receiving end from neuropsych evals that a parent will share their evaluation with a school, or maybe, a person like yourself would fax it over or put it in the snail mail and it comes to the school. And so, we, on the school side, we still have to do our own evaluation and then consider all the information held therein, the report that you had sent. I guess I think sometimes we receive that. I don't really know what to say about that. I think sometimes I felt like I have wanted to reach out to the neuropsych and ask for more clarification.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think that people who are on the call have had a lot of maybe personal experience with this. And so I'm just wondering how the group is in the habit of receiving neuropsych evals, and if they've been able to communicate with the neuropsych, or how they've kind of merged the outside findings into the report. I know that Dr. Sarah Litsky is on our call today. Sorry to put you on the spot, Dr. Sarah, but she works also in the schools and as a clinical practice. And so maybe Dr. Sarah might have some insight.
Hi, I'm here.
Hey.
Hi there. I want to, hold on, I think it's weird when I can't see myself, but I feel like everybody else can. So I'm trying to figure out how I switch my screen a little bit. Okay, hold on one second. Well, anyway. So Erin, in terms of your question about being able to interact and ask questions and kind of the flow of things, let me know if there was something more specific that I'm not addressing or kind of answering. But it is interesting. And then also in the school world. Uh-oh, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
You cut out for a second.
I started fidgeting with my AirPods, which are sitting on my desk, and then my screen told me that now my input was my AirPods. So I wasn't sure if you could still hear me. I will stop fidgeting now. So it is interesting to me to kind of see how things work in both worlds. And at this point, I've pretty much paused doing assessment in the clinical realm because I'm just doing so much testing and writing in the schools right now and things like that. But, on the school end of things, it's interesting for parents. It's always an interesting role to help try to bridge the understanding of what has happened and what has been learned in more of a clinical assessment, and then what can or can't be translated in terms of criteria or supports, or what can or can't happen. And of course, it's always so frustrating. Some districts we work with or systems we're working within are really very reliant on the discrepancy model yet. And so we're doing what we can on our ends as related service providers to help kind of move everybody along. But when, within the neuropsychology realm or the neuropsychological assessments realms, it's so challenging when great data and understandings of learning disabilities can be captured, and then we aren't, with the criteria that we have, necessarily able to translate that directly into our assessment criteria with box for checking. So in terms of being, I think now I'm just rambling, Erin. Can I help answer a specific question that you were having?
I put Erin on the spot really by just saying, did anybody have questions? So, I think this is really what happened in my presentations that I gave for Anoka County social workers. They were basically saying the same thing about what are we supposed to do as clinicians when children are given these diagnoses and families get thorough assessments, and then the services at school aren't yet accessible. And so I'm collaborating a little bit with Anoka County on doing a bit more for, trying to think about, I founded this organization. That's what my mission is to really help children get what they need in terms of children who with ADHD, one of the biggest things for me is helping them figure out how to move, because it's not fair to just say to teachers, your child, these students need to move. And so it's figuring out how to do that in a way that's not super disruptive, but that we all know that children that have these learning differences need a different type of learning setting. And it's really the same with qualifying for learning disability services or not. I mean, we have to find a way so that is not so black and white, like they qualify or they don't, and that there's more of a continuum.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm seeing like Paul Johnson had a comment that it's really difficult to explain to parents when kiddos don't qualify through school as having a learning disability.
Yeah.
But they have maybe recently had a neuropsychological evaluation that diagnosed a learning disability from a medical perspective. And sometimes on my end, sitting at the table or on the team, it is really frustrating because we feel bound by some of the criteria. And sometimes it's frustrating in a different way because maybe what we're seeing at school doesn't match what is happening or is being identified as a medical diagnosis, or it's not to the significant degree enough for special education services to be provided, where it might be to a degree that, outside intervention, it's in order for a child, we have to work from the perspective of free and appropriate education. So if whatever, we'll just call it symptoms, are being identified in a psychological evaluation, aren't necessarily playing out in school in a way that we're able to document and qualify, then it's not blocking a kid or getting in the way of them accessing a free and appropriate education as other children would be. So it's a tricky dance. And
it is.
It happens in all areas, not just learning disability areas, right? I mean, there do exist children with autism spectrum medical diagnoses that would have, for whatever reason, their features or their symptoms aren't significantly impacting their ability to function in school. And that's really challenging, understandably, for parents to understand. And, elements of mental health diagnoses and things like that as well. So, it doesn't always translate back and forth, and it's always an interesting job to try to bridge the understanding. And, as a parent with child with I have 4 children. Some of them have diagnoses, and I can totally understand where, parents want the help. And so sometimes when I'm speaking to people doing neuropsychological assessment, or when I'm the one doing it in a clinical setting as well, I try to be careful about the language that I use in recommendations, or also just verbal, results reporting that, bring it to the school and see if this maps, not just like go to school and get this, because it puts parents and families in a position to be kind of on the same team as the school, and really the schools want to help. So
I think, that's a great point. That is something that is a really good point, is to see what the wording you use is huge. And as Dr. Hallwell, I was saying, I mean, I can't remember what engagement it was, but he was talking about how sometimes if it's just a terrible fit with the, and this is just a complete extreme, but if there, some schools, the ability to access services is a lot easier. And if you are having if that is an experience for a family where it's just like everything they're trying to get in terms of support is not working, sometimes it makes sense to shift settings. So that is also an alternative. So anyway, I think we can all agree that these things can be challenging. At the same time, getting a private assessment and looking and having a diagnosis, even if the school isn't going to, let's talk about my friend's child. She was diagnosed with dyslexia later in life. For her, it meant a lot to know why in the world she couldn't read. Mm-hmm. She couldn't get the services, and she made too good of grades to get the services in school. They didn't see the academic impairment, but everybody else in their family was a great reader. She always wondered what the deal was with her. Why did it take her forever? And just knowing has been a relief. So it isn't always about that other part, the service part. just on a different note.
It helps the families know how to kind of support or get accommodations, or the kid to self advocate for what they need and start to kind of learn those things as well. Yeah.
So Erin, I have on my schedule, I have that I'm speaking till 11:15. Is that should I speak for a few more minutes and then, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good.
I have to look at my notes because I do not remember, so.
Okay, good. All right. Well, let's just talk for a few more minutes. The detective mindset, and I think about this a lot when I'm working with children, is really kind of trying to understand what is going on here with this child. And so how do we do this? Okay, this is a good way. This is a good short little video. And the way that I learn, I told you guys earlier that my son is really into Taoism right now and learning, and he's very into Thich Nhat Hanh and reading to me about Thich Nhat Hanh. And so anyway, this is not something I'm trying to press on other people, but this is just the way he describes being a compassionate listener is something that has helped me in my practice and working with children. So I thought it would be something to share.
You refer to, I can't remember which book, but you talk about deep listening also.
Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of the other person. You can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose: help him or her to empty his heart. And if you remember that you are helping him or her to suffer less, and then even if he say things full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable to continue to listen with compassion. Because you know that listening like that, with compassion, you give him or her a chance to suffer less. If you want to help him or her to correct his perception, and then you wait for another time. But for the time being, you just listen with compassion and help him or her to suffer less. And 1 hour like that can bring transformation and healing.
So I love this idea of deep listening, because oftentimes when someone comes to you and they want to really vent, they want to purge whatever is going on inside them, people start talking and giving advice. So if you allow the person just to let whatever those feelings are to come out, and then at another time come back to them with your advice or your comments, you would experience a deeper healing. That's what you're saying.
Yes, the fear, the anger, and the despair is born on the ground of wrong perception. And we have wrong perceptions concerning ourselves and the other person. And that is the foundation for conflict and war and violence.
You've said that the only way we can begin to end war is due to communication between people.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And we should be able to say like this: dear friends, dear people, I know that you suffer a lot. I have not understood enough of your difficulties and suffering. It's not our intention to make you suffer more. It is the opposite. So please tell us about your suffering, your difficulties. I'm eager to learn to understand. It has to start like that, loving speech. And if we are honest, if we are true, they will open their heart and tell us. And then we practice compassionate, deep listening. And during the process of deep listening, we can learn so much about our own perception and their perceptions. Mm-hmm. And that is the best way, the only way to remove terrorism.
Terrorism, or even difficulties between yourself and
yes.
family members or friends.
Yes.
And the principle is the same no matter the conflict.
Yes.
Terrorists, anti-terrorists,
yes.
father and son,
right.
Yourself and your boss,
right.
Yourself and your children, your best friend.
Yes. But for this, the type can help him or her.
Okay, I'm trying to get out of this video. But you know, what I have had parents say to me, so I've shown this to a few parents in our sessions, and it's really clicked. People are saying, I'm trying so hard to be a compassionate listener, and I'm learning so much about my child because I'm shutting up. And I'm just learning when they're struggling with school. I've decided to just practice finding out what's going on. And so it's made such a difference in my practice. I thought I should share it.
You refer to, I can't remember which book, but you
look at me. Okay, so we've just got about 3-4 minutes, and I'm going to talk with you about sensory differences in ADHD for a sec. So one of the things that I read this book written by a teenager, and I reference her book is in my reading list, but she has autism, and it's about her experience with empowering herself on how to manage her symptoms. And I think as providers and teachers and all of the, everybody here, it can get like a weight on us as to we're the ones to try to problem solve. And it's so nice to have this idea of having that our students are problem solving, and they're the ones that we can help them develop like a backpack of survival skills. And we know that so many kids with ADHD have sensory differences. So it's really, this is my son's recommendation. He was like, everybody should have a noise canceling headset who has ADHD, so that when they're doing their work, they can just put it on. And, obviously everyone's not going to like this that has ADHD, but it helps him tremendously with doing his schoolwork because he needs it to be so quiet. The teenager talked about how for her being in the lunchroom is like she can't tolerate the smell in so many places, this teenager that has autism. So she puts a little bit of like lavender underneath her nose and she brings it with her to school, and it's what allows her to manage so many smells, and it just helps her anxiety lessen. She always has fidgets, so do many of my clients, and I work with them on making sure they bring their things with them and show them to me. And chewing gum, like sugar-free gum, is a big one that helps a lot of students get through testing when they're in my office, or just be able to keep moving in a way while they're sitting. And sometimes I see that kids have a lot of trouble with, like, if there's one little thing bothering them. And I see this a lot with students with ADHD. It's like, if a little bit of their lip is bothering them, then it's like all they can think about. Just like that child is like, if you tell me to sit up, all I can think about is sitting up. And so it's like having different supplies that student can have to address those things. Tissues, wet wipes, just, an arsenal of things that help you feel better. And I think it's a perfect time to take a break.
Thank
Are
you.
you there? Yeah.
I'm here.
Yeah, so it's 11:15, so I thought might as well break.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Quie?
I'm going to open the chat so I can see it.
I'm going to share my screen real quick.
Sure.
So at this time, we're going to take a break until 11:45. And sorry for the lag. So Dr. Quie had mentioned that she has some books that she made a list of. And so our Hannah put in the chat, and we'll put it in again, that this conference has a link to its own website. And so Dr. Quie's materials are going to be inserted into this website. And you can see that there is a little tabby for the book recommendations. And we have them broken out for families and then for children. And also Dr. Hansen has added to this some of her recommendations to the book list. So perhaps you want to take a look at that while you're taking a break, or perhaps you're doing other work-related things, but we'll pause here and then come back at 11:45, and at which time we'll be talking with Dr. Hansen.